before I begin today, I have a question for you, Delilah. You running away, Delilah? I have a question for you. So Delilah and I saw each other last night at the WNBA All-Star Game. And Delilah was wearing something, and I said I liked it, didn't I? And you said you'd bring me that thing today. So do you have it with you? Are you going to bring it here? And then we'll let people decide if I ought to use it during the sermon. So thank you. So these are Phoenix Mercury color bows that Delilah was wearing in her hair. And I said I liked them, and she said, well, I'll bring you some tomorrow. So the problem is my hair's not really long enough to get them. Well, it kind of stays in. You think it looks nice? It would look nice on the stove. Maybe it's a little pinchy, but maybe I'll wear them here. How about that? Does that work? Does that work? No, it doesn't. Delilah says no, but maybe later. Well, I'll put them up here because I don't have much hair here. I don't have as much. You'll put it on. Okay. Well, when you put it on, we can do it. All right. So when I was a kid, I liked some of the same things that Delilah likes. And Delilah, do you like Disney movies? Do you like Disney movies? I liked Disney movies when I was a kid, and that's probably a pretty common experience, right? And my favorite Disney movie was a movie called Robin Hood, and that was a movie that featured red foxes in the lead characters of Robin Hood and Maid Marian. They were the foxes, and Little John was a bear, and Friar Tuck was a badger, and King Richard and Prince John, they were both lions. Okay? And living in Utah, the closest that I could ever get to experiencing interactions with Disney characters in person was when Disney on Ice would come to town. Once a year, Disney on Ice would come to an arena that doesn't even exist anymore. It's called the Salt Palace. It's long gone, now replaced by what's now called the Delta Center. Right? But I remember going to the Salt Palace and watching Disney on Ice every year. And I remember going to see the Disney movies when they were re-released in the theaters. I remember going to see Cinderella, Snow White, things like that, Pinocchio, Peter Pan, all of the great hits, you know. And Christmas just wasn't Christmas unless I had a chance to watch Mickey's Christmas Carol. Every year, Mickey's Christmas Carol was one of my favorite cartoons to watch. Okay? Now, my family subscribed to the Disney Channel, so we got to see a lot of specials and a lot of cartoons and a lot of movies. And some of these specials talked about this place that sounded, to me, as a little boy, so magical and maybe even mystical. That place is located in a town called Anaheim, California, and that place is called Disneyland, and you may have heard of it. I don't know. They don't do a very good job of marketing, the Disney company. Now, I heard so many stories about people who had a chance to go to Disneyland. All my friends, cousins, people I knew, and they'd come back and they'd tell me about how great this place was. This place was wonderful. There were rides, and there were games, and there were characters there, cartoons, shows, all kinds of things. My grandma went to Disneyland once with some cousins, and she brought me back a pair of, not quite as nice as these bows, but she brought me some mouse ears, a little skull cap that had mouse ears on it, and on the back was written my name in yellow thread and in cursive writing with a little Mickey Mouse at the end of my name. Okay. And I would watch the annual Disneyland Christmas parade and the annual Disneyland Easter parade, and I knew from seeing it on TV, and because I knew people who had been there, I knew that this place existed, and I knew that it must be great. And one time, I even had the chance to see Disneyland from outside the gates. We were driving through Anaheim, California, at a sporting event in Anaheim, and we drove right past the main gates. And I remember being so excited, and yet it was so close and yet so far away. And that parking lot looked huge. Now, that parking lot that was there that day is not even a parking lot anymore. Now that parking lot is a second park. It's called California Adventure. But a year later, a year after I saw Disneyland from the outside, that's when I finally got to go to Disneyland for the very first time. Now, I was young at the time, and my siblings were even younger. And so that means that it was kind of difficult to do all the things that I wanted to do, age ranges for rides and things like that. And to complicate the matter even further, this visit to Disneyland took place during the week between Christmas and New Year's. And if you have any experience with any kind of amusement park, you know that that's probably the absolute worst time to go if you want to beat the crowds. If you like crowds, go during Christmas and New Year's. If you don't like crowds and you don't like waiting in line, don't go around Christmas time. Okay? The lines were tremendously long, and my brother and my sister were fussy, and my parents were grumpy. But guess what? I was finally in this magical place. So none of that didn't really matter to me. I was finally in Disneyland. I had known Disneyland existed, and I knew it was going to be magical. And I knew going there would change my life. And it did. It did. Because I'll never forget my first trip to Disneyland. I loved that place so much that when I was old enough to drive, I eventually bought an annual pass to go to Disneyland. Now, in the old days, you used to be able to get an annual pass if you were a Southern California resident for $99. You can't go one day now for $99, but I had an annual pass. I paid $100 for it, and I could go to Disneyland anytime I wanted. Okay? And that's not all. I've been to Disney World probably 5 times or so, and I've been to Disneyland in Paris twice, and I would love to go to Shanghai Disneyland and Tokyo Disneyland and Hong Kong Disneyland, and maybe someday I'll get to do that. But as cool as those experiences have been, or hopefully will be someday, they're never going to compare to that first visit to the original park. Okay? Now, I've had a lot of what you might call mystical or magical feeling experiences in my life. And most of them were magical because they were things that I had kind of imagined for my whole life. I anticipated that these things would be great. I grew up dreaming that one day I might be able to play college football at Notre Dame. And so the first time I was able to walk on campus when I went back to see a football game in the stadium that I hoped to one day play in, it was magical. It brought tears to my eyes. Okay? I dreamed of one day experiencing a total solar eclipse. Now, I had seen plenty of partial solar eclipses in my life, and I even saw once an annular eclipse, and that's when the moon is further away from the earth, so it doesn't fully cover the sun, and what you see is this floating ring of fire around the moon, and it's pretty cool. It looks like a floating wedding band in the sky. It's pretty neat, but that experience just doesn't compare to a total eclipse. When I was finally able to experience totality, my body trembled. I was in tears, and my body trembled. And I had known what to expect. I'd read all about it. I'd seen videos. I'd heard people tell me stories about their experiences with total eclipses. But at the same time, you don't really understand it until you've had a chance to experience it. For several years before I was ordained a priest, I would spend time imagining what my ordination day would be like. I dreamed about it. I imagined my ordination day all the time. And when it finally happened, I almost didn't believe that it was happening. As the bishop laid his hands on my head to ordain me, again, my eyes welled with tears. So I ask you, what are some of the experiences in your life that have been similar and meaningful to you in some of those ways? Because I bet you've had some. I bet you've had some. I bet there are some things that you've been wanting to do for your whole life. Now, sometimes we call this list of things a bucket list. And in other words, it's a list of things that you want to make sure you do before you kick the bucket. That's where bucket list comes from. Okay? And I had a pretty extensive bucket list. And I've got some bizarre news for you. I've completed it. I've completed my bucket list. Just this year, I checked off the last thing that was on my bucket list, which was a total eclipse. And that tells you something. That tells you it tells you that I had so much anxiety, is what it tells you. It doesn't tell you I'm driven. It tells you I had a whole lot of anxiety about not wanting to die and not have these things happen. That's what it really means. And so I did all of these things by the time I was 42. And so I think what that tells us is that I need to add some more things to my bucket list. I think that's what that means. But what about you? What are your bucket list items? Have you checked some off? Have you checked them all off? Are you still waiting to accomplish some of them? The people in today's gospel passage had a bucket list. And that bucket list included receiving healing from Jesus. They yearned for that healing. They yearned for that grace, and they yearned for that love. And they knew that they would get these things from Jesus. And they probably imagined what this day might be like. The day that they could be free. They imagined it. They dreamed of it. They did it. And then when they encountered him, their encounter lived up to the anticipation. Now, sometimes the experience itself doesn't quite live up to the expectation. Sometimes we make things in our minds, we make them out to be so great that when they finally happen, they're kind of a letdown. Right? What if, for instance, that total eclipse would have been totally boring? That would have been a lot of money to spend for 4 minutes, right, if it were something boring. What if Disneyland would have been kind of a rundown place and not any fun? What if Notre Dame Stadium turned out to be a place that was a horrible place to watch a football game? What if Jesus in today's story didn't show up when these people were expecting him? What if he chose not to heal people? What if he would have been a jerk? What if people would have shown up and Jesus would have been a jerk? We've all heard people say things like, don't meet your heroes, because sometimes that can lead to disappointment. What happened? What if that would have happened with these people meeting Jesus? What if he was a letdown? And I think, if we're honest with ourselves, we have to acknowledge that sometimes people's experiences with Jesus have been letdowns. And this isn't because Jesus let them down. It's because Jesus' people sometimes do let them down. And these are people who often mean well, people who attend church, people who think they're helping, but sometimes they're really not. Theology is challenging because God's ways don't always mesh with ours in a way that we can fully understand. And we as humans can have a tendency to oversimplify things. And when we do that, we can have a tendency to speak in cliches and in platitudes. And we can say things when something bad happens to somebody. We hear people say, well, everything happens for a reason. Or when somebody dies, we hear, well, he's in a better place. Or even, well, it was God's will that these things happened. And those kinds of statements are conversation stoppers. So instead of asking open-ended questions like, where do you experience the presence of God with you during your suffering? We can really put a dagger in the conversation by telling someone that their loved one died of cancer simply because God needed another angel. People fall away from the church for all kinds of reasons. And I guarantee you, none of those reasons are Jesus. They might include falsehoods that people have learned or have been told about Jesus, but no one has ever felt the love of Jesus and rejected it. So what's our role in this story? Our role as Christians is to enhance the relationship between Jesus and his people who are in need of some of that healing. Our gospel story tells us that everyone who believed was healed. Now, this doesn't mean that they were healed because they believed. It means that their belief enhanced their healing. It helps us to make meaning if we can understand things a little better. So how often do we ask, why? Why is this happening to me? Why do I have this medical condition? Why did this person have to die at a young age? And when we ask why, we're kind of asking the wrong question. We're oversimplifying it. Because God isn't some kind of a vindictive guy who sits up in heaven playing chess and we're the pawns. God wants us to heal. And our faith brings us closer to understanding our relationship with Him. If I have a terminal illness and I go down a rabbit trail of wondering why God did this to me, well, I'm not going to be super thrilled about the idea of having a relationship with God. But if I can reframe it and seek God's presence through my suffering, I just might stand a fighting chance at receiving the love of God in challenging times. It may not bring me the kind of healing that will extend my earthly life, but it'll bring healing to my spirit, and my healed spirit might even be tempted to check off a few more items on my bucket list. So how's your bucket list coming along? Have you had a chance to complete some of the items on your bucket list? Have you done what I did and let your anxiety just get the better of you and lead you to a point where you just felt like you had to complete everything out of fear and anxiety so early in life? Are you maybe indifferent to completing a bucket list? I don't think there are right or wrong answers here. But bucket lists exist because none of us gets out of here alive. Are there some things that you'd feel disappointed about if you died without having done them? Well, don't let avoiding leading people to the healing of Jesus be added to that list. Former Archbishop of Canterbury, William Temple, famously said that the church is the only institution that exists primarily for the benefit of those who are not its members. All those people who came to be healed by Jesus through faith, they didn't know Him yet. They didn't know Him yet. They weren't members of who we consider to be Jesus' followers. And Jesus brought them healing, and He showed them love. And by doing so, they became His followers. When our bucket lists include leading people to Jesus and helping them to recognize His loving presence in the world, and they are the beneficiaries of some of that mystical magic. Magic, by the way, that is far more real than anything we experience at Disneyland. That's when we will grow the church. And that's when we will lead people to know that they are loved. Amen.